Welcome to today's webinar, Life After Carbon, the Next Global Transformation of Cities, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on behalf of the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website in the next few days under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get smart growth news and information and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Life After Carbon, the Next Global Transformation of Cities. You can also search for event number 919-9921. I'd like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and create solutions to its complex problems. Participants of today's webinar are eligible for a discount on books in the Island Press catalog by visiting islandpress.org and using the code WEBINAR. So to get started, our speaker today is Peter Plastrik. Peter is the co-founder and vice president of the Innovation Network for Communities, established in 2007. He was a founding consultant of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and helped it develop its strategic plan and innovation fund. He also consulted closely with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and managed the network's innovation fund. Pete has been the lead author on several Innovation Network for Communities reports about cities and climate change, including essential capacities for urban climate adaptation supported by the Summit Foundation and leadership by U.S. City Innovations in Climate Action supported by the Bloomberg Philanthropies. He is co-author with John and Madeline Taylor of Connecting to Change the World, Harnessing the Power of Networks for Social Impact in 2014. He also co-authored 2 books with David Osborne, Banishing Bureaucracy, The 5 Strategies in 1997, and the Reinventor's Field Book, Tools for Transforming Your Government in the year 2000. His most recent book, Life After Carbon, the Next Global Transformation of Cities, written with John Cleveland, was published by Island Press in 2018. Following his presentation, Peter will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during his presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, I'm still trying to get the screen doing the right thing here. I'll be with you in a second. So I want to thank Michael and John Coleman and Maryland State Government for hosting this webinar, and I want to thank Jen at Island Press for helping to put this together. And I want to thank all of you who have tuned in, to use an old way of describing what we're doing. I hope that you, your families, and your communities are safe and resilient, and will stay that way for a good long time in this difficult time. I'm broadcasting from my home studio in Hansville, Washington. My hope is that our dogs, which occasionally intervene in these kinds of sessions, will stay quiet. And my wife urged me to be fascinating in describing to you the contents of our book are, and I hope to do that as well. I hope you've noticed that there are really three topics today for the webinar. I will be talking about our book, Life After Carbon, the contents of that book, the big ideas in it. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about research that we've been doing into the climate emergency declarations of local authorities around the world.
Peter, I don't mean to break in.
And some new research that...
Excuse me, Peter, I don't mean to break in, but your PowerPoint is not full screen. You might have to switch to the other monitor. You might have to share your other monitor. How many monitors do you have?
I just have one.
Okay, so can you put it into full screen mode at the bottom? No, it's still not in.
It is.
Oh, it is? Okay.
It is. Are we okay to proceed?
Yeah, we'll go like that.
And so the third topic we'll be discussing is research that we've just started about the connection between the pandemic, climate change, and how communities respond, something that is on a lot of people's minds. So just a quick introduction. John Cleveland and I have worked with cities worldwide on carbon mitigation and climate resilience building for the last decade or so. As Michael reported, we are co-founders of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. And John helped to create and still manages the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, which is a private sector and university-based commission that is aligning its efforts with the city of Boston's carbon mitigation and resilience building efforts. We've been writing a series of reports about what cities are doing and how they do it. Urban decarbonization planning, managed retreat, financing resilience have been some of the topics that we've addressed. We're just completing a report on climate emergency declarations by local authorities, which is what I'll talk about in a little bit. And as I said earlier, we're starting a research project with Boston University on the connection, the linkages between the coronavirus, climate, and cities, and how cities might respond in order to keep their climate action going. Last year, we published Life After Carbon. This was developed from insights about how cities that are most aggressively tackling global warming and climate change are being fundamentally changed by what they're doing. A lot of the reports that we've written and others have written are more about what cities are doing to address climate change. We took a different approach here. We were trying to understand how addressing climate change was changing the nature of cities. And as we looked to the history of cities, we saw that there was a new evolution in the nature of cities. It's starting to occur, driven by the effort to deal with climate change. This is not just our vision for what should be happening. It's a noticing and a synthesizing of what's happening on the ground in many cities with lots of big implications. As a part of this presentation, we're going to do some survey questions as well. Two times we're going to ask you all to respond to three questions. The first three are really foreshadow themes in our book, which I'll be discussing in detail. And then the second three questions toward the back end of today's presentation will be more about the coronavirus and climate intersection. So I think we'll get started by asking 3 survey questions now that will help set up the conversation about the book. Michael?
Peter, I'm just going to ask you to do one thing for me. If you go up to the slideshow menu above, on your click on slideshow, because you're
hang on, I got to get out of full screen.
Yeah, because your slides aren't advancing. All we're seeing is your edit. Okay, so go to the slideshow menu at the top. Transitions, animation, slideshow.
Yeah, sorry, it's not coming out of full screen yet.
Folks, I think he's in full screen, but it's just not able to view through the thing. So we'll just proceed.
Where do you need me to be, John?
You have to share the screen.
We'll share the screen and then we'll prompt the first poll question for folks.
Yeah, then we'll help you once you open your screen.
I'm showing the main screen.
Now go to the slideshow menu. At the top.
Yeah.
And then do start at beginning. It's actually not changing.
Well, did it change now?
Well, it went to the next slide, but we still see all your editing tools.
All right.
So if you click on the slideshow menu, there you go.
Yeah,
and then
I'm
go
there.
play from start, play from start.
I'm there.
Okay, we're not seeing anything. Maybe
Is that
it's
what you
best. Yeah, well, now it's all white, so maybe it's best we just go back to the way you did it before. You'll just have to manually move them. Oh, there we go. All right, thank you.
Okay.
It's probably my rural transmission delay. Sorry.
Okay, so we have the first question on the screen here, which is, to what extent is your community seeking to turn the emerging renewable energy economy into urban wealth, business activity, and jobs? You can see the responses there. We can get folks to respond to the poll. We'll just wait another moment or two for folks to respond. I can see them coming in. Okay, so we have 63% doing a little of this, but could be doing more. 24% this is not something we're trying to do, and 12% all in. This is an important strategy for the community. And we have the second question here. Folks can see on their screen, which is, to what extent is your community seeking to restore and tap into the benefits that natural systems provide to enhance and protect urban life? And you can again see the responses. Folks are voting now. We'll just hold it open momentarily. And here the response, 66% doing a little of this, but could be doing more. 22% all in. This is an important strategy for the community. And 12%, this is not something we're trying to do. Move into the last question, I think. Okay, folks can see this on their screen. So what extent is your community seeking to boost the capacity of residents at core systems to adapt successfully to climate change? A couple more seconds for response and we'll post the answers. So in this case, 60% doing a little of this, but could be doing more, 26% not something we're trying to do, and 14% all in. This is an important strategy for the community.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll talk about these results in a little while, but just in summary form, these three questions reflect some of the big changes that are going on in communities across the world. In some places, as we can see, as a part of a strategy and bigger moves that are being made. In other places, probably more a project here or there, and some thinking about the direction that the community might take. And then in some places, it's just not registering yet as a new idea for how to organize urban living. The polling results suggest what I probably would have suspected anyway, which is that a small number of communities are really in the lead on embedding these ideas, this new way of thinking about things in their strategies as communities. A large number of communities are starting to work with these kinds of ideas, but have not really embedded them in a systemic and strategic way. And then a number of other communities are let's say, lagging behind this, not tackling things this way. And so this sets up some of the conversation about the new ideas that we discovered as we looked at leading edge cities on climate change. But before we go into that part of the book, I want to really describe some of the background information that we developed as we were doing the research for this book. And we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner of my screen with Benjamin Franklin. Ben Franklin actually got cut from the book's final manuscript. He was not, he doesn't appear, but I really liked the story that we tried to tell, intended to tell. Ben Franklin was 18 years old in 1724 when he got on a boat in Philadelphia and spent 7 weeks in a turbulent voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to get to London to pursue his career as a printer. He was an ambitious young man, and London was the place that you went if you wanted to seek your fortune in the colonies. And so we took a look at Ben Franklin's journey through London. He lived there a number of years because we wanted to answer the question: what does a city look like before the advent of modern cities, before the advent of fossil fuel burning at huge scale? What did cities look like before there were modern cities everywhere? And so I want to describe London just a little bit to make the contrast between what cities look like back then and what they look like now, which underscores the idea that cities have evolved significantly. And also to make it clear that cities are cities through time, even though they evolve. There's something at the essence of cities that stays the same in a lot of ways. So London was already a very large city, one of the largest in Europe. It was the heart of a worldwide colonial empire. It was an inland port visited by thousands of ships that carried spices from the East Indies, sugar from the West Indies, tea from China, wine from France, and timber from Russia. So it was the core, the urban core of a worldwide empire. It was a hotbed of the scientific revolution and of Protestant reform, and it was a destination for job seekers from the countryside. There was an enormous migration from rural areas into the city, from Ireland, from Scotland, from the European continent, and even from distant colonies in America. If you zoom in on 18th century London, the details reveal a set of pretty arduous conditions by contemporary standards. The narrow cobblestone streets and alleys and bridges were congested with pedestrians, vendors and their carts, horse-drawn transport. Roads became muddy and flooded in winter. They were impassable. They were unpleasantly dusty in the summertime. Dirt and pollution filled the air so much that candles were sometimes needed at midday in busy shops to see anything. And travelers approaching the city were always noted that it had a distinct smell, a sooty odor. The streets at night were lit with oil lamps, which was a technology thousands of years old. Buildings were poorly constructed and with shoddy materials. The bricks crumbled, and then they were patched up, and it was not unusual for buildings to collapse, and they were only 3 or 4 stories tall. Within some buildings, burning of coal provided the main source of heat, belching thick clouds of irritating, choking black smoke into the city's air. There was no indoor sanitation, and people commonly emptied their chamber pots out of their windows and left garbage on the street to rot. Open sewers ran through the middle of many streets, and gutters carried away human waste. And the offal from butchers' stalls and tons of horse manure filled streets daily. A network of sewers carried rainwater only. London delivered water from the Thames to residents through hollowed out tree trunks running underneath the streets. The river, the main thoroughfare for commercial shipping, also received all of the city's discharge. To avoid drinking the water, and this gets you to Humphrey Bogart on the bottom right corner, residents turned to gin. There were 8,000 places in London that sold the unregulated intoxicant. Many of the area's wealthy residents avoided all of these conditions by living outside of the city, commuting into this commercial center and exclusive shopping districts on regular coach services, and navigating in the streets in sedan chairs carried by porters. So that gives you a picture of what city life looked like in a city nearly 300 years ago, a leading city in the world. Most of that London, Ben Franklin's London, is gone today. Some of it is preserved in historical sites and museums. Some of the symptoms of urban living remain. As we know, you probably noticed this as I was describing London: congestion in the streets, excessive pollution in the air, the escape to intoxicants. Notice that liquor sales are much higher these days than they were just a month ago. But both London now, today's London, and London then are recognizable as cities. There's a certain crowding of energized humanity, a massive built environment, constant motion, lots of noise, lighting, and of course, an enormous amount of economic activity. And yet so much about London has changed. A city that was on its way to having 1 million residents back then now has more than 8.6 million in Greater London. And the core, and it's the core of a mega city, a city of cities that has 14 million people in it. Thousands of buildings now tower over the landscape. Millions of automobiles and trucks provide a primary source of mobility. Electricity is used everywhere. Solid waste is collected regularly and wastewater flows to treatment plants. And who lives in London, in the city, has changed too. It was once the epicenter of white colonialism. Now it's 44% Black or minority ethnicity origin. So this is a picture of a city over time changing in some fundamental ways that reflect lots of drivers of change, which is what we'll be talking about shortly. What is it that actually changes cities? So let's turn to another city now. These are some photos from Copenhagen. Copenhagen is 900 years old. It's got about 760,000 residents, so it's a mid-sized city. It's a city that has embraced the climate crisis as an opportunity. It has championed innovative urban design to respond to climate change and the shift to a clean energy economy. It wants to be a climate innovation supplier to the world through its companies and by positioning itself as a laboratory for the kind of changes that climate change requires from us. The city is known worldwide for its bicycling, and now it's known for constructing a waste-to-energy facility with a ski slope on the roof. These are a set of pictures from that ski slope. from above the waste facility. The city aspires to be the world's first carbon neutral national capital within 5 years. It's not waiting until 2050 for that. Its goal is to get there by 2025, and it is on track. I bring Copenhagen into the picture because it's one of 25 cities that we've worked with and studied that we call urban climate innovation laboratories. It has set radical goals and taken a systemic approach and addresses GHG reduction and resilience building together. Its innovations include offshore wind farms, district scale heating systems, bicycling as the preferred in-city travel mode, citywide stormwater management relying on green infrastructure, and many more innovations. And it's one of the greenest and most economically productive urban areas in the world. In some ways, it's a terrific model for the kind of city that we think is beginning to evolve in the 21st century. Several years ago, as we were researching this book, we identified 25 cities worldwide with this kind of focus, a Copenhagen-like focus on ambitious climate action. There are others too, but we focused on this 25 across a number of continents. And some are now emerging also in response to the awareness that global warming is an emergency, not just a problem. And so the 25 cities form the database for life after carbon. Being an urban climate innovation lab is not just about addressing climate change. It's also about making a better city. And this is an important theme in all of the cities that we work with. They increasingly communicate their climate aspiration around the theme of how the city will become a better place to live, not just a climate-friendly place to live. Our book explores what is this better city that's being created? How do we get there? Life after carbon covers about a 300-year period. It's from the early 1700s to the present day. From the pre-modern city that I described, Ben Franklin's London, to the rise of the modern city driven by fossil fuel consumption, to the emergence of the post-carbon and climate resilient city, which is really just beginning. We worked backwards to early London, and we've also started to try to look into the future of the 21st century to understand what's changing and how it can change. So how do cities change? You have to go back more than 300 years, as we did, to get an understanding about how cities evolve. During our research, I found an illustrated children's book, A City Through Time, on the screen, that captured what most historians have to say about city change, from ancient times to city in our time. It's more than a 6,000-year arc, from the Greek colony to the Roman city, to the medieval city, to the industrial city, to the modern city of, quote, steel and glass, as they put it in A City Through Time. Numerous factors get cited by historians that explain why cities change, how they change, and all of these factors still occur today. And they're listed on the right side of the screen: technology, natural disasters, conquest and war. The history of large cities being sacked and devastated is quite fascinating. Disease, population migration, etc. But the biggest factor that is usually pointed at for the development of the modern city, let's say from 1800 to the late 1900s, is technological changes that were brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Starting with the steam engine that was designed by James Watt in Glasgow about 50 years after Ben Franklin arrived in London, and around the same time as the American Revolution was occurring. Watt greatly improved the efficiency of earlier rudimentary steam engines that had been developed around the time of Ben Franklin's birth. He figured out how to create a 75% reduction in the fuel needed for the output of the steam engine. And so the efficiency of the engine was enormously improved, which changed the economics of using the engine. The British recognized the importance of Watts's invention and banned the export of the engines. Some Americans, including George Washington, schemed to get one to the United States so they could exploit its technology. The steam engine, as we all know, spawned enormous changes in manufacturing, in travel, and other functions in the society, all of which consumed fossil fuels and drove an enormous increase in fossil fuel consumption. Now, a premise of our book is that while technology is important, ideas also have the power to transform cities. And climate change is changing our ideas about cities. And so we have focused our attention on what are the ideas behind the changes that are occurring in various cities. Many of the innovations that cities like Copenhagen, London, and others are using are technology driven. Think of solar energy, electric vehicles, smart microelectric grids, biodigesters for organic materials. There's an enormous amount of technology being applied to this transition. But as we looked at what cities are doing now, we focus not on the specific innovations and technologies, but on ideas. We asked ourselves, were there any basic ideas that helped to drive scientific, economic, social, and other changes in cities, now or in the past? Were there ideas that made a big difference? And if so, what was the power of these ideas? And so in this slide, we talk about the rise and the spread of the modern city. These questions about ideas led us to look more closely at the way the world has become urbanized in the past 200 years. In 1800, about 3% of human beings lived in cities, according to demographers. Only London and a handful of other cities around the world had reached substantial size. Today, though, it's estimated that by 2050, 2/3 of people will live in cities. There are already 500 cities with more than 1 million residents worldwide. Greater Tokyo's population of around 35 million is larger than that of all cities in 1800. So that gives you some perspective about how urbanization has taken over the planetary landscape. And we had a crucial insight about the nature of this change. As we became an urban dwelling species, we made cities in the same basic modern image. They are places with massive, complex systems for buildings, transportation, energy supply, waste, water, etc. And they use much of the same technologies and processes, and they're professionally managed worldwide. The modern city became a global phenomenon, and almost all cities pretty much look the same and operate in the same way, in spite of differences in their culture, their location, their climate, etc. So this led us to a different question, which was, how did the template for the modern city rise and spread, and how did it do it so quickly? It turns out that many important new ideas spurred the rise of the modern city. This slide provides a summary of what those ideas were, or at least some of those ideas were. And I just want to read it to reinforce the notion that there are important ideas that are driving things. These ideas worship the use of markets and capital to create massive wealth and meet social needs. This was new. The worship of markets had not, if you go back to Ben Franklin's London, of course there were markets, but the idea that markets were the driver of the economy and that they were a driver for human prosperity was a new idea that was developed in the early 1800s. These ideas celebrated the role of ever-increasing material consumption in producing personal and social benefits. They revered the control of the planet's natural systems through science and engineering. They admired acts of will that sought to shape the future. They had an underlying theme, the power of human beings to shape their individual and collective well-being, free from nature's constraints, I should emphasize, since we're talking about climate here. So there are a few of these specific ideas. One, markets rule the economy. The role of cities in the economy is subordinated to the needs of business. Provide them with labor markets, provide consumer markets, provide free public infrastructure, provide low costs. Cities were at the back end of a market economy. The growth of consumption was considered to be a public good, a civilizing force. Consume more, that drives economic expansion. Do it at all costs. And as we all know, that excluded environmental damage from the equation. Third idea, re-engineer and control nature to meet cities' physical, economic, and social needs. And this is something we still do all the time. These ideas inspired numerous changes in the design and function of urban spaces and systems in existing, expanding, and new cities. We looked at how these ideas underpin the emergence of fixtures of modern living like department stores and sewers and automobiles. We noted that those urban innovators who created the department stores, who created the sewers and the automobiles, those urban innovators faced many of the same technical, financial, political, and challenges as today's urban innovators. As new gas and water services arose, who should provide the service, the public sector or the private sector? Where would the massive investment come from? How would prices and quality be regulated? Which technologies should be used? All of these are the same questions that the climate innovators in cities we're working with are asking themselves today. Now here's a quick sidebar. I was fascinated to read about the first Peking to Paris automobile race. This occurred in 1907. 5 European-made cars were shipped to Peking for the start of the race. They were the only cars in the city. Local officials didn't want them driven on the roads of the city, so they required that they be pulled by mules. That race occurred at a time when the automobile industry was just starting up and cities were just beginning to accommodate the automobile industry. Today, Beijing, not Peking, Beijing contains 5 million cars, so much exhaust emissions that they are sometimes banned from the road. So we go from 1907, 5 cars in China's capital, to 5 million cars now. That's a part of this evolutionary pattern. So our conclusion was that modern cities arose because the new ideas became a widespread way of thinking that urban leaders, whether they were elected and appointed government officials, entrepreneurs and business owners, architects, engineers, or other professionals, consumers, civic activists, they found these ideas extremely compelling and used them to make decisions. These decisions change city space and in turn reshape cities' economic, social, and environmental fundamentals. Modern cities became places where the fossil fuel economy could organize and obtain the mass labor and consumer markets that factories needed without being held responsible for the environmental damage it caused. Starting in the early 1800s, the logic of capitalism entwined with urbanization and spread a fossil fuel economy worldwide, and that produced the global warming that is disrupting cities today. I want to take you on another slide journey to Melbourne, Australia. As we were writing the book, I traveled to Melbourne for a meeting that opened with a tour of the downtown area led by an Aboriginal guide, Dean Stewart, who is down there in the photo at the bottom of the middle of the slide. I realized as we went that Dean Stewart was describing the arc of the modern city. From 1835, when Europeans first arrived at the mouth of the Yarra River, they founded Melbourne, they laid out a street grid, they brought in thousands of sheep and cows and horses. They developed all of this on what used to be a eucalyptus farm on wetlands with kangaroos, thousands of indigenous people. When gold was discovered inland a few years later, tens of thousands of fortune seekers arrived from around the world. Melbourne became a boom town. Stuart, on his tour with us, points to a spot in the river, not in the picture that I've got here, but, and he says that there was an ancient waterfall about 5 feet tall, lay across the river, and that the waterfall was like an umbilical cord that physically connected the entire traditional population of the region for thousands of years. It had profound significance, spiritual significance for the entire humanity of this area, he says. Every single one of us would know the ancient creation story of the waterfall. We'd know the music of this ancient river system. We'd know the songs of the mountain ranges, the music of the landscape, of the animals, of the plants. Melbourne had a different view of what that waterfall meant. To allow boat traffic to go up and down the river and to reduce flooding, the city blew up the waterfall. It displaced the Aboriginal civilization that had been present for tens of thousands of years. Today, more than 4.5 million people live in Greater Melbourne, and they are deeply connected to the global economy. Today, Melbourne is one of the 25 cities that we studied, and it's seeking to reduce its carbon emissions and increase its climate resilience. And city leaders are consulting with Aboriginals in order to gain the knowledge they have so they can understand how better to live with the land, how to consume resources without producing waste and without destroying nature. So that gives you some sense of the multiple cities that we've been looking at and the story that we found as we were working through the history of these cities, as well as understanding what they do. So I want to talk a little bit about the rise of urban climate innovation laboratories, the database of cities that we took a look at. Melbourne and a few dozen other cities. You can see the names of them on the left-hand side of the slide. They've been transforming themselves by initiating scores of experiments and adopting innovations for urban action. All of these are aimed at radically changing their city systems. We call these cities urban climate innovation laboratories, and they have several key characteristics. They are intentional about recognizing the necessity and opportunities in urban climate action, and I want to stress the opportunities. They don't just see this as avoiding disaster, they see this as evolving a better city. They are working on the major core systems of the city. They're not just doing projects here and there, they're tackling entire systems, energy systems, waste systems, water systems, etc. And they're leading a culture change process that's changing minds and habits, even the identity of people in their cities. They're able to sustain this level of change, usually despite political changes, because there's a loose consensus in the city and alignment around acting boldly on climate change. When we looked carefully at these cities and what they were doing, we identified 4 basic ideas that they are using behind all of their innovations, and that these ideas are replacing the ideas that the modern city grew up with. In fact, these ideas don't just replace those ideas, they contradict them. I'm going to briefly discuss each of these ideas that are in the table on the slide. Carbon-free advantage. The new idea is that the economic role of cities has changed. They are highly productive engines of innovation for the economy, concentrations of creative human capital, drivers of wealth creation. They're not just the settings in which businesses, markets, and capital drive economic growth, and in which cities pick up the damage. Some of the theorists, some of the other folks behind these ideas, Richard Florida, Jane Jacobs, Jeremy Rifkin, and many, many more. The shift to renewable energy makes it possible for cities to become to produce renewable energy, coupled with increased electrification and the use of smart technologies, and to participate in that expanding global energy sector. Copenhagen, Vancouver, and a few other cities have taken this opportunity serious and positioned themselves as incubator laboratories and developers of companies that are creating the new clean energy tools, equipment, technologies, and exporting them to the world. The second idea, efficient abundance. The new idea is that cities can more efficiently use energy, materials, natural resources, and space to generate abundance that is sustainable, holistic, and equitable. And it's not just about growth and material abundance and consumption, which has been found to lay waste to ecosystems, produces waste and toxicity, and great variations of prosperity among people and nations. It's about a different kind of abundance for the future. William McDonough, Ed Masria, the Brundtland Report in 1987 have been big advocates of this kind of approach to creating abundance. Nature's benefits. The new idea is that cities can tap the power of natural systems to enhance and protect urban life instead of seeking to dominate, control nature, and eliminate much nature from cities. It's a shift away from thinking of a city as having some nature in it to thinking of the city as being in nature and working with nature. Tim Beatley and his Biophilic Cities Network has been a prime advocate of this. Eric Sanderson, the author of Mannahatta, and a number of other urban planners have really been pushing the nature's benefits idea. And then the last idea, adaptive futures. The new idea is that cities must build the capacity of their inhabitants and their core systems to prepare and adapt successfully to the uncertainties, the uncertain requirements of the climate changing future, not assume that they can control the future and simply impose their will. The future is no longer a blank slate on which we can write our chosen adventure. Resilience and adaptation is more than a climate and physical problem. It's a whole city challenge that involves shifts in who should be deciding what a city should do. How is the collective public interest formed now? Henk Ovink, the old, the 100 Resilient Cities organization, environmental justice advocates are all onto the adaptive futures ideas. These four big ideas sum to a new way of thinking about cities and where they are going. They respond to the imperatives of climate change, but this gives rise to a very different and we think feasible vision for what cities should become. When I started the Climate Emergency Project, which I'll talk about in a minute, one of the things I was looking for was what's the vision that cities that are declaring a climate emergency have for where they're headed, for what their future looks like. And as I was reading through their vision statements, and I've got three of them here, one from Barcelona, one from San Francisco, and one from Mornington Peninsula Shire, which is just south of Melbourne. It seemed to us that these ideas both sum a lot of what the, or this part of the vision sums a lot of what the ideas that we've identified, the postmodern ideas that we've identified lead to in a city. And it also seemed as though these cities were embracing very similar visions for where they wanted to go. And so this was a little bit of evidence for us that these kinds of ideas are starting to take hold, not just in the innovation lab cities that we've talked about, but in other cities as well. And I'll go back to the survey results that we had a little earlier, where 2/3 of you said that your communities were at least doing a little of three of the ideas that we referred to earlier: emerging renewable energy economy, nature systems benefits, and building the capacity of residents and core systems to adapt. And so there's increasing evidence that this set of ideas is taking hold across a wider range of cities in very different kinds of places. These ideas are also spreading as a result of actions that are not being taken by local governments, by business, by professionals, by consumers, and by state and local and national governments. There's more evidence of this all the time. Remember that the research and the manuscript for this book finished about 2 years ago. And so the evidence that we had then, which we thought was quite compelling, I think has been reinforced by further developments. Energy supply markets are shifting toward distributed production of solar and wind energy. The electric vehicle market, slow to take off, but is going faster now. Real estate development markets are moving toward greater energy efficiency. Zero emissions buildings in the future are becoming a new standard. Healthcare systems are adopting green and healthy procedures, including energy efficiency and reducing food waste. Cities are starting the journey to zero waste and circular economies. Cities are adopting nature-based solutions at significant scale, like green infrastructure. And greening is becoming a mainstream professional practice with architects, landscape architects, and others. So I'm going to shift now to the climate emergency research. As I said earlier, we think that some of the climate emergency declarations that we've seen from cities actually underscore the transition that we've been describing. Our study of climate emergency cities, which was done for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, identified 15 communities in 8 nations that went beyond advocacy for more climate action by higher levels of government, and instead also looked to what they could do locally that they hadn't already tried to do. They've been adding new ambition, new strategies and actions to the playbook for urban climate action that's already been established. We identified 5 strategies that are coming out of the emergency action plans that respond to the climate danger and that take climate action planning at the local level into some deeper and new directions. And I'll just briefly mention what those 5 strategies are. Accelerating carbon reduction targets. So instead of 80% reduction by 2050, you have cities now declaring that they intend to become zero emissions or net zero emission cities by 2040, even 2030. There's an acceleration of the ambition. They're expanding the solutions for reducing local emissions in all of the emission systems. They're tackling emissions produced outside of their local boundaries by looking now at what emissions are created in the products that their residents consume, even if those emissions are created outside of the city's boundaries. They're drawing down carbon through natural means, such as planting forests or turning organic waste into compost that can be added to the soil and sequester carbon. And they're upgrading many of local governments' decarbonization capacities in various ways. This report should be made public in probably the next 30 to 45 days by the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. It's still just being edited as a part of the final process. Before we go into the conversation about the pandemic and its relationship to local climate action, I'd like to put 3 more survey questions on the screen just to get a sense of what you're experiencing in your communities. And then I'll talk about the pandemic and we'll wrap up the presentation. Michael?
Sorry about that. You can see the question on the screen there. Has the coronavirus pandemic's impact on your local community begun to shift resources and attention away from the battle to reduce carbon emissions and to strengthen climate resilience? And the response is yes, no, not yet, but it will, and it has had the opposite effect. So we see the response here, pretty well split, 35% yes, 31% not yet, but it will, 30% no, and only 5% has had the opposite effect. Now moving to the next question. Has the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the socially vulnerable populations helped to spark political will for equity criteria in local climate policies? And the responses here are yes, no, and I can see signs that this may start to happen. We'll close it momentarily here. So it's a good split between 42% See, I can see signs that this may start to happen. 40% no and 17% yes. So one final question here. How useful would your local officials or advocates find an analysis of how to maintain reduction in GHG emissions that pandemic responses such as reduced vehicle traffic and increased gardening or farming have produced? How useful would local officials find this information? Very useful, lots of interest, somewhat useful, might get some attention, and not useful. Not at top of mind, it won't be for a long time. And we'll close this momentarily. Okay, in this case, 53% somewhat useful, might get some attention, 33% very useful, lots of interest, and only 14% not useful, not top of mind.
Thank you, Michael. So just to reflect quickly on the survey results and then to introduce the topic here. It doesn't diminish the attention and the emergency that we're paying to the pandemic of the virus to also be concerned about its impacts on climate change, the other emergency, let's call it for now. And as your survey responses indicated, there's already been an impact on local governments and their ability to continue on their climate change action pathways, both the financial ability, the staffing ability, and the will to do it. At the same time, the pandemic has raised substantial awareness about underlying inequities in the society and the way they create vulnerability for certain populations. And this has long been a theme, particularly in the climate resilience field. And then lastly, nobody really has a roadmap about what to do if you want to still consider climate action as a top priority in a time when all of a sudden there's really only one top priority, which is health, safety of and welfare of your residents, and somehow reestablishing economic activity. And so what we decided to do, as you can see from the screen, is to ask a set of questions that really are about how do you make sure that the pandemic does not set back climate action for years to come. And we're doing research now. I wish I had answers for you, but at the moment, what we've done is try to frame this question up so that we can get the research done and make sure that the research is relevant for local climate action leaders. 2 weeks ago, we started this research with our partner, Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy, to try to understand the negative and potentially beneficial impacts that the pandemic response may have on local climate action. We've tapped into many voices of local concern, especially local government sustainability directors in the US, and recognize that there's a wide range of issues and problems that are being raised right now, and that answers are hard to find. So we initially developed a framework to identify and focus on several organizing principles for communities to consider. That's the 4 items on the screen. 1, make the case that the pandemic crisis actually increases the urgency of acting to avoid climate catastrophe. A number of experts, commentators have been trying to make this case. There's starting to be quite a bit of body of literature around this. And we're looking to synthesize it and figure out how to make the case so that it's a local case, not just a case in general for everybody. Number 2, identify how to maintain the climate gains and reverse climate losses that have been caused by the pandemic. So it's been widely noticed that air pollution is way down in cities. You can see the sky in New Delhi, things like that. There are reports from all over the world about this. Now, obviously, we're not going to shut down the economy forever and thereby reduce air pollution from vehicles and other sources. But it still leaves a question open about are there things we've learned about behavior changes now, telecommuting, for example, that could be further incentivized and put into a more sustained mode, even as we recover from the coronavirus pandemic. Another example is a number of cities have been shutting down car traffic on streets. Large amounts of streets are now blocked off. So is that something that could be to some extent maintained, given that some cities, Oslo, Barcelona, and others, have already, before the pandemic, had already been starting to shut down parts of their cities and prevent automobile traffic going into those places. Number 3, insist on economic and social equity in federal and state policies. I was actually heartened by the survey results here, where 42% of you said that you can see signs that the awareness of inequities in the coronavirus situation might carry into awareness of the need for equity in local climate policies as well. And so that's something that we think needs to be pushed, but we hope to inform local officials about how to do that most effectively. And then the last item, use the pandemic stimulus to strengthen and accelerate local climate work. There will be more federal stimulus packages, including perhaps a federal infrastructure package. And so the question that we're asking here is, other than saying, let's have shovel-ready projects to get people back to work, how can you also have projects that put people back to work in a post-carbon way, a green economy way, in ways that create other benefits in cities? That's the bulk of that project. I'd be happy to hear more from folks about their ideas about these 4 different principles, and we should be producing some material in the next 2 to 3 weeks for this. So my last slide, really a summative slide. In conclusion, the theme that we keep hitting on is that reinventing cities, evolving cities, is not new. It's not a strange thing that all of a sudden we're having to do. It's something that has occurred over and over again in the 6,000-year history of cities, and it certainly occurred in the last 200 years to produce the modern cities that we live in, and that we are now trying to change. And so, as we say in the bottom of this slide, this is not the first time cities have reinvented themselves. It is the next time. And I hope you take some comfort from that and also find that exciting, because the evolution and the reinvention of cities has been one of the great human projects of the last thousands of years. Just want to remind you that our book is available with a discount of 30% from islandpress.org. And at this point, I'm happy to turn it over back to Michael for questions and whatever else we're going to do.
Great, thank you, Pete. And we'll ask you to turn on your webcam if you can do that while we transition over to the questions and answers. We'll acknowledge also that we received more than the usual number of comments about audio. So I'm not quite sure what the problem was, if there was something with GoToWebinar. What we found is most of those questions tend to be on the user end, so it's hard for us to help unless other than to point you to the direction of what GoToWebinar provides. So we've been assembling questions from the audience throughout the presentation by Pete. We're now going to move into the question and answer session. You can continue to submit questions as we move into the discussion, and we'll answer as many as we can till about 2:30 Eastern, so we got about 25 minutes or so. So thank you, Pete, for being with us today. So first question for you. As cities like San Francisco declare a climate emergency, will those policies result in more or less affordable and/or workforce housing? Or will poorer residents continue to need to use transportation to get into the city instead of living in the city?
Michael, my webcam is trying to connect, but is not making the connection happen. So shall we just continue with audio?
Yeah, you can, and then we'll see if we can resolve that moving forward. But if you want to go ahead and answer that.
It's a great question, and in fact, it's getting more and more noticeable that affordable housing is such a huge problem in so many cities, and it takes center stage when you have a conversation about climate and so many other topics. What we're seeing in the climate emergency is, I think, a couple of things that are relevant here. One is there is a commitment, an espousal of just transition, climate justice, those kinds of equity-oriented principles that almost all of the cities that are doing climate emergency declarations are embracing, at least rhetorically. And in theory, that kind of transition ought to include concerns about affordability. Because as cities become more expensive, and some of what climate action does is make cities more expensive, as cities become more expensive, affordability declines. Some cities have concluded, and they've done this with careful calculation, not just off the cuff, have concluded that they can make affordable housing, new affordable housing, as green as possible without creating an undue cost burden on the developers or on the residents of affordable housing. I've heard this conversation in Vancouver, just recently in Boston. And so the analytics, and I think Boston is now requiring the greening of all future affordable housing that the city invests in as well. And so there's a gradual movement toward green affordable housing, let's call it, which can have many aspects, from energy to the materials that are being used to the design of the housing itself. But this is still, I think, early stage, and it is mainly talking about new construction. It is not yet about retrofitting. There are a number of cities that have focused on retrofitting for affordable housing, particularly around energy consumption and renewable energy. But this is, I mean, candidly, this is a nut that a lot of cities have talked about, but have not really figured out how to crack. And there are other kinds of pressures. There are challenges in some cities where the effort to increase affordable housing bumps into the question of how much open space and green space is going to be preserved in the city, as opposed to allowing it to be developed. So I'm hopeful that more and more cities are paying attention, and that they will devise more effective methods for solving this problem. But I think we're in the early days of this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Next question is, what is Copenhagen's definition of carbon neutral? Does it include all public and private uses? And if so, how are they engaging in holding the private sector accountable?
I think the answer to that is, so first of all, they are using the classic inventory model for a city, which is about the emissions produced within the city's boundaries. I don't think we're including consumption emissions or embodied emissions in the calculation at this point. But it's beyond just what the municipal government's emissions are. It's for the city as a whole. Copenhagen starts with a couple of advantages as it moves in this direction. One, the national grid is high in renewables from wind and hydro. And so they don't start with the problem of an electric system that's 80% fossil fuel driven. And the city itself, something like 95% of all buildings are heated through a district heating system. And so they have a single system that is city controlled that they can use to provide heat to buildings, and therefore they can manage the energy inputs to those buildings, which they've been doing. So they start with a number of advantages. I believe that they are counting public and private. But because of some of these advantages, the private sector is not necessarily a big polluter of carbon emissions, and they are also, Copenhagen is also, I think, intending to be a net producer of wind energy that it can sell outside of the city into other markets as a part of also reaching net zero emissions. Many cities define net zero or carbon neutrality in different ways. We've been looking at, what's the glossary for these different definitions and what do they actually mean. Copenhagen's definition is in line with most other cities, but its deadline of 2025 is at least 5 years ahead of almost any other city that we've seen so far. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pete. There's another question about Copenhagen, I think from earlier on. Were past changes to cities mainly due to economic reasons? And are the current changes in cities like Copenhagen dependent on particular policies being in place and therefore more at risk of being stalled?
So I would say yes. I would say when we look at the development spread of the modern city, I would tend to argue that it was very economics driven, both by the ideas that we talked about, these notions of markets creating a greater good for all, consumption being a civilizing force, and then also the dynamics of capitalism, which created enormous potential for making profits in adapting the new technologies and playing into the large consumer markets that were there. So I would tend to say there were other factors, but economics drove so much of the rise of the modern city. When we've talked with Copenhagen about what might stall its progress in moving forward on climate in a way that is linked to creating a better city, they would say that a large scale recession of the sort that we're probably going to end up going through will certainly create challenges because it drives up investment capital that's available to utilities, to the city, as well as to private businesses and to residents. And so the availability of investment capital is an important factor. They have some level of anxiety about labor market change if they go through a serious spell of unemployment. And by the way, Copenhagen was 30 years ago in deep trouble as a city and came out of that. But if they were to go through a spell of deep unemployment, that could, if nothing else, that could change public attitudes about investing in some of these other kinds of activities that don't necessarily have immediate payoff as job creators or business activity. And so it's not that Copenhagen is on an inevitable forward march. There are all kinds of factors that can affect how fast it goes and how comprehensively it goes, including national policies, which can change. They've had changes in which party runs the national government, and that has affected the enabling context for the cities. So I think in general, they would say that there's a consensus, and it's a very young community. There's a consensus on moving forward, but there can always be some bumps in the road. Thank you.
Okay. The next one is both a comment and a question. Peter, I fear the focus on ideas is misfocused. Shouldn't we think of the ecology of the city, not the idea of the city? Urbanization has taken over the globe, but it is not ecologically self-sufficient, so cities will prove to be sustainable.
Well, I would say ideas matter, and they're not the only thing that matters. Power matters, technologies matter, various things matter. But our effort was to say, look, if you're trying to understand how the modern city became so standardized as a template and so spread across the world, it wasn't just technology, it wasn't just policies. There were a set of ideas that we all share, that we all, we've all bought into to some extent. It's kind of like the water that the fish swim in that they don't even necessarily recognize that they're swimming in. And some of these ideas, we would say, are being challenged and are changing. And so therefore, these ideas are worth focusing on and paying attention to. I don't think that takes away from the natural ecological factors that drive what a city can be, what a city ought to be. It's just a way of saying there are ideas that also matter, that become embedded in academic institutions, in disciplines, and more importantly, in the expectations that most people have about the way things should be. And one of the things that's been hard about pushing climate changes is that you're actually pushing against received, deeply embedded ideas that people have, whether they recognize it or not, about what ought to happen and what ought to not happen in cities. Control of nature is a good example. The idea that that water system out there really should be up to us to decide which way the water's flowing in the river is an idea that most of us take for granted at this point, because we've been acclimatized to the engineering of nature idea. Dismantling that idea, posing alternatives, investing in alternatives, is a lot of swimming upstream against a lot of these ideas. That's why we thought it was useful and important to signal some of the idea changes that are going on here. Thank you.
Okay, kind of moving on here. Widespread electrification of natural gas infrastructure when natural gas as massively cheaper is difficult. Are there cities with very cheap natural gas and widespread gas furnaces that have successfully made this transition?
I'm not aware of cities that have made that transition. I understand the challenge that's involved. Cities that are serious about making the natural gas transition have essentially done something of this sort. They pick a date in the future where they're going to ban natural gas use for home heating, and then they incentivize the switch to other systems, to electric-based systems. They incentivize it financially and in other ways, so that people have a chance to make the switch before the ban comes into place. Whether that's going to solve the problem or create a backlash, a number of cities have moved in this direction because the market wasn't going to get them there all by itself, which I think is the point of the question. Some cities have tried to figure out, what do we do with natural gas infrastructure? There are assets, pipes, and other kinds of facilities. Can it be converted to something else? Or is this now a stranded economic asset that we have to deal with? A lot of cities have concluded that if they do not deal with the natural gas conversion, if they don't get out of natural gas sometime in the next, let's say, 10 years, they cannot possibly meet their goals for reducing carbonization from their own sources. And so I don't have examples of that, but the pattern that we see is the use of regulatory, use of the stick accompanied with carrots, because there's the likelihood that the market, and particularly the cost-driven side of the market, will make these changes is pretty low. And then lastly, a number of cities have now started to ban natural gas use in future construction as a way of not further exacerbating the problem. Thank you.
Okay. Our next question is, can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between historic buildings and life after carbon? Since buildings 50 years old are classified as historically significant, how do we determine which to preserve and which to replace?
Well, two things there. In a lot of cities, London comes to mind, much of the infrastructure, the building infrastructure is not historically preserved as a category, but is old. And it was also built in ways that are not easy to insulate or retrofit, at least not cheaply. And so those cities have been wrestling with this problem for years now, and candidly, in most cases, they have not succeeded at instituting a retrofitting pace that will actually get them to their goals. I think San Francisco's climate emergency analysis said that they needed to retrofit 3% of all buildings every year for the next 20 years or so in order to reach their goal for that sector. But they had not come close to that percentage in the past years, right? So there's an upping of the game that's necessary on retrofitting older buildings. The question of historically preserved buildings, here's another place where I don't have a lot of answers, but we have looked at a couple of examples here. This is coming up more and more due to sea level rise in coastal communities. Old port areas, old harbor areas often are not just historical areas, but are in a preservation designation with certain implications for what can and cannot be done. And so we're finding cities on the on the east coast of the U.S. are meeting with the state preservation commissions and other experts to try to find out, are there ways that we can actually preserve these buildings consistent with what we know about adaptation to sea level rise that don't violate the rules of preservation or that allow us to loosen the rules of preservation so we can move forward. And what's at risk is if we don't figure this out, if we don't make these moves, then these buildings will get washed away at some point. I'm not aware of any specific strategies that have emerged from those conversations. Charleston, South Carolina, I think Miami Beach area, Norfolk, Virginia, have all been starting to face this problem and trying to find solutions for it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next one is, how can cities more quickly reap the benefits of a carbon-free approach? If these cities quickly become recognized as gaining ground in other cities, perhaps adoption of new approaches will be adopted more rapidly by all cities.
I think that's right. I mean, it's the premise of a lot of the network building that has gone on between cities, which is let's share what we know, let's share our examples, let's go see what the leading innovators are doing so we can do it as well. And so there's a tremendous amount of that kind of sharing going on. And I've been in lots of groups, lots of site visits, et cetera, that do that, and they do take home the lessons, and then they have to apply them in their own contexts, right? And so I think there's a lot of that going on already. A number of cities, and I'll use Vancouver as an example, a number of cities have understood that, I'd say understood this. As they become more green in certifiable ways, not just by declaring that they're green, but in ways that are recognized. So cities that have been actually reducing their carbon footprint, and many cities have. As they then make other changes, they green the city, they reintroduce nature into the city. They're finding that people like these cities better, and particularly young, talented entrepreneurs want to live in cities like that, and so their cities become green magnets, so to speak, for the talent that can drive economic development further and economic growth further. And a number of cities have reached that conclusion. Copenhagen, Stockholm, London, Vancouver have reached a conclusion that moving aggressively on climate action and measurably as a part of the greening strategy and then part of the green branding creates all kinds of other advantages for the city that are pretty important. I think more and more cities are going to start recognizing this, that the decarbonized city is a, quote, better city. It's got less air pollution. It's therefore less health problems due to air pollution. It's got different kinds of economic opportunities. As that story gets out there, we think more and more cities will start looking toward those kinds of actions as ways of creating a comparative advantage for themselves as cities. It's one of the reasons we thought we should write the book, as a way of helping other cities understand where the new comparative advantage for cities lay. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. We have time for a couple more here. Here's one. Most renewable energy tech still depends on carbon in its construction and production. How can we reduce our carbon output with these current tools?
If we're talking about embodied carbon in, for example, construction materials, a number of cities now, and we saw this in the climate emergency material. It was a part of one of the strategies that we described of starting to work on emissions outside of the boundary of the city. And so a number of cities, and I'll use Oslo as a sort of lead example, have basically said, we want to have carbon-free construction sites. We want the embodied material to be carbon-free. We want the demolition in sites to be carbon-free. We'll recycle things. And so I think Oslo has created the first all-electric construction site. They're banning the use of fossil fuel equipment on construction sites, and they've piloted that in some areas. Other cities, Vancouver's an example through its longer-term zero emissions building code, are looking at how to now start getting embodied carbon out of the supply system, out of the supply chains that are going into the construction sector. And there are cities around the world that are looking more thoughtfully at this question. But it involves starting to take responsibility for carbon that is being produced outside of the city's operating systems and being essentially imported into the city. And we thought it was pretty interesting that a fairly large number of the climate emergency cities that we looked at were starting to say, we have to take responsibility for consumption emissions that are created outside of the city, rather than just acting as though the only emissions that matter are the ones that we create within our boundaries. Thank you.
Okay. Kind of looking forward here. What advice would you give a young urban planner working on climate justice?
Oh, that's a great question. I do get contacted by young climate planners and young urban planners about career advice. I think where we are on just transition, and it has a number of dynamics, including how will people who have been in the fossil fuel industry be employed in the future. But the piece that we've paid more attention to is equitability of the changes that are coming, the social and economic equity in this. And what I would urge planners to be thinking about is how are we going to go beyond the rhetoric and the espousal of just transition and climate equity and climate justice to the actual practices? What does it actually look like to do it in cities? There's an emerging set of ideas and some tests around this, but frankly, an awful lot of what still gets said is is at the at the aspirational level and not at the practical, here's what I can do. And until we get to the point where there are tools and processes that can be used by lots of people, you're not going to get much adoption. It's not clear what you're adopting at this point. So if you can, I mean, there's the starting point of being an advocate for this, and that matters because not nearly enough people are yet advocates for this. But ultimately, the question becomes, what does it look like to do this kind of work? What does it look like to actually make a city more equitable? Well, one answer can be include people in decision making, yes, and there are ways of doing that. But which decisions? And even if you made decisions to be more equitable in certain practices, what does it look like to be more equitable? I think we're building a knowledge base on this and a practice base on this, but it's still very much early days. And I think that that's where the invention and the interest is going to lie for people early in their careers, is to build that practice in a way that can be institutionalized and standardized. That would be terrific development. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Pete. So with that, we're reaching 2:30. I'm just wondering if you have any kind of concluding thoughts to share with the audience today.
Really, the one thing I just wanted to say, I assume if you've signed on for this webinar, that you're active at some level, hopefully the community level, in working on climate actions of all sorts, and you've probably been doing it for a while. And so, I just want to thank you for doing that work. In a lot of ways, it's been difficult work. It's exciting because it's innovative and transformational potentially, but as we all know, it's also controversial, and like all change, it can be a real slog. And so I want to say thank you for your commitment, your dedication to that work. And I think the other thing I want to say is don't lose hope. There's a lot of work to be done here. I do believe that the world can work on two emergencies at the same time. But we have to think more carefully about how to do that now, given the pandemic emergency. And what we don't want to do, frankly, is retreat or concede much at this point. There may have to be some concessions, but what we really want to do is be highly strategic about what still needs to be pushed and how to push it, because the climate crisis, as we all know, it's not going away. It's going to get worse. And we need to act as soon as possible in as many ways as possible. So thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Pete. And thanks to everybody who was here today. This will conclude our webinar, Life After Carbon, the Next Global Transformation of Cities. I'd like to offer a big thank you to Pete and for a great presentation, to everybody who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make all this happen, especially now that we're all working remotely. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org in the coming days. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email tomorrow that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. So please look for this follow-up email if that is useful to you. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our e-newsletter for details on other future webinars. We are working to provide you with webinar programming during this period of teleworking for many planners. So if you do have a topic, a potential panel, or a suggestion, please include it in your evaluation or email me at michael.bayer1@maryland.gov. And please visit smartgrowth.org and watch for our email blast for more information on future webinars. We have other programs in the work and we'll be sending out that information soon. Have a great day.